Volodymyr Zelensky, who seems to have gone out of his way to resist any move of President Trump to reach negotiated settlement. He was talking about the issue about, again, how he's trying to find a peace deal on his terms, but then makes a comment about something that's coming up on May 9th in Russia.
Вони повинні робити чіткі кроки до завершення війни. І ми наполягаємо, що безумовне і повне припинення вогню має стати першим кроком. Росія повинна це зробити. Зараз вони переживають, що у них парад під питанням. І правильно переживають.
Kind of a veiled threat. I want to start with that. I got a couple things from that I want to ask about. Do you think that Ukraine actually would attack the parade when there are a number of even Western leaders going to be in attendance there?
I think it would be the height of strategic foolhardiness to do that. I wouldn't put it beyond them, but it would be incredibly foolhardy. I would also expect, though, the Russians to have made sure that they've taken the full measures to ensure that that attack was not possible. So I'd imagine that they would have very good air defense in position around Moscow and wherever the parade's taken, and extremely tight security as well. Not that would necessarily stop it, but I think it would reduce the chances a lot. But it would be incredibly foolhardy, especially with Western leaders there and leaders from across the world as well. So no doubt there will be leaders from, well, we know that there will be leaders from Czech Republic. I suspect that Orban will be there. But to attack those leaders would be the height of strategic foolhardiness. They would lose any final support, I think, that they've got, including in Europe, which is important because once the Europeans do finally change their mind and decide to get out, then I think the Americans will be relieved, and that will be that. But no, I would be surprised if they did it, but wouldn't put it completely past them.
If I'm not mistaken, Xi Jinping is going to be there in person. I believe I saw. Certainly Brazil and several of these others. But, one of the other things he said in there is just the same thing he keeps trotting out time after time and gets repeated in Europe time after time and just puzzles me, I got to say, and just kind of wonder if you can help pierce through with the surface level inconsistency here of continuing to say we need to put more sanctions on Russia to force them into compliance with the terms that we want to see. Is there any rationale for that whatsoever?
No, none. I can see none. I mean, we know that the sanctions have had a worse effect on Europe than they have had on Russia, which was entirely foreseeable and predictable. But also we know that the Russian economy is growing, and according to Alexander Mercouris's analysis, which I support, it makes logical sense to me. The Russian economy, one of the reasons the Russian economy is growing is because Russian businesses are moving into the space that European and American businesses left. So we've lost business. The Russians are gaining business, and their economy is growing. I think the figure's around about 4%. Here it's in Europe. I mean, there's good evidence to say that Germany is already in recession, and France and Britain on the verges of recession. And part of that is because of the sanctions. So, I wouldn't put it past European leaders to try more sanctions, but I also would expect those sanctions to have a much worse boomerang effect on the sanctioners as opposed to those who are sanctioned. And the idea that Zelensky can dictate what European leaders and American leaders should do in pursuit of an obviously unobtainable objective, I always find it's a delusional way of thinking, insisting on conditions which and I know that on the battlefield are militarily unachievable.
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons why Zelensky may have these delusions is because he's not alone. Here on American television, I think it was yesterday, we had Keith Kellogg, who's designated as Trump's envoy to Ukraine to try and solve this war, went on to talk about what he thought of the Russian side. It's not quite the same as what you and I think.
Russia's not winning this war. Russia has not made any major advances in the last year and a half. They haven't taken the city of Kyiv, the capital. They haven't pushed to the west of the Dnieper River, which is a major obstacle. They haven't taken Odessa. They've lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and they haven't really moved anything. It moves by meters, not by miles. And the Ukrainians are fighting on their own soil. They're fighting hard. So when Russia says they're winning, no, they're not. If they are winning, they've already won this war after 3 years, and now we're into our fourth year.
Well, let's just take that on the surface level. Is Russia winning?
Yeah. I mean, I mean, see that we don't have a monopoly on not very clever generals. You've got some over there as well. I mean, I'm sorry to say it, but actually, I think the International Institute for Study of War, Ukraine, Russia have been advancing for the last 30 months. Now, the assumption that Russia will do this in a way which is the maneuver doctrine which you and I were trained on is they don't have to follow that. And he's obviously forgotten the objective of Russia, which was not to capture territory. The objective of Russia was to actually denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. And so they're doing that on the battlefield by attrition and very effectively, as far as we can see. If the figure is as bad as we think, of 1.4 million Ukrainians dead, I mean, it's a horrible thing to say, but that's very, very effective in terms of achieving the demilitarization aim. And when you think about things like the Dnieper River, I'm sure the Russians would want to get to the Dnieper River, but they'll do it in their own way. And why would they do it in a way which actually squanders Russian manpower when they can do it in a much more effective and way where actually slowly I would expect them to break the Ukrainian forces? I think Bodenov actually said that they could last until the summer, and then they could expect a collapse. And there's going to be some culminating point at that stage. You could imagine the Russians moving much more quickly as they're through this largely urban area into a much more difficult to defend rural area. And then I would imagine them wanting to go as far as the Dnieper. He talked about Kiev, but the Russians haven't gone for Kiev because it's not within their strategy. I mean, I think what the general was trying to put to guess was what was Russian strategy, and I think it's nowhere near what Russia's strategy is, because it wouldn't have been a strategy that, as he described it, that would have achieved Russia's objectives. So I think objectives, we've talked about denazification, we've talked about demilitarization, and I think the last of these, well, of course, there's not having Ukraine in NATO as well, but the last of these is the general security of Russia. And to me, I keep coming back to what if they can see that it's going to be difficult working with the Europeans and with the Americans, then they want to get to a situation where they've got a buffer and a strategic depth, and that strategic depth seems to be a natural line for the strategic depth is Dnieper, all the way down to, and then the question remains about Odessa, and if I had to bet, I would bet that if time allows, they'll take Odessa. And then
and in fact, I think it's Patrushev, one of the Putin's advisors, has been saying on Russian media in just the last 48 hours that it would be really great if we took Odessa because there's a lot of Russians there. Again, kind of bringing the issue and fanning some light up underneath it. One other, okay, so that's militarily. That's General Kellogg. On the media / intellectual side here in the United States, we also have some trouble here. Now, one wonders, chicken or the egg kind of thing. Does people like Fareed Zakaria, who has in some quarters quite a good reputation, he's really an intellectual fellow, and a lot of the things he said over the years I think are very rational and even thought provoking in many places. But on this issue here, he seems to be reading from the Keith Kellogg book, from the Volodymyr Zelensky book, because they all seem to be aligned on what they believe are the overall conditions. Watch him here talking about a complaint against Trump for not putting enough pressure on Vladimir Putin.
What isn't getting discussed is what Ukraine needs to stop fighting is some kind of security guarantee, both from outside countries and also the ability to build and maintain a very powerful army. If it doesn't have those security guarantees, Anderson, it's not going to stop fighting. These guys are fighting for their country, for their freedom, for their independence, for their lives. They're not going to just, even Donald Trump, no matter how powerful the American president is, will not be able to order the Ukrainians to sign their extinction as a nation. They won't accept that.
So see, he has this view that, well, the Ukrainians, they just won't accept that. Meaning there's a choice to be made. In his mind, there's a simple choice. Trump can either make a choice to help Zelensky, or he can make a choice to help Putin. Golly, I don't know why he's trying to help Putin, but the Ukraine side, they're not going to play with that. They'll choose simply not to ignore that. But here's the question. Can he choose? Can the West writ large choose not to follow through with the terms that are offered by Russia?
I think the answer is no. I mean, I come back to the balance of power argument. I mean, the balance of power, as well as the balance of the military situation, which are two slightly different things, overwhelmingly favors Russia. Russia's operating on interior lines. It has large industrial capacity mobilized for war or for this special military operation. And it's outperforming the West in terms of the West, not just Ukraine, in terms of its industrial capacity. It's winning on the battlefield. The Europeans are weak, and they'd struggle to deploy. I don't know, a British brigade and a French brigade would be the maximum, I would imagine. And of course, those would be attacked. The Americans are unwilling, not surprisingly, to actually commit American troops on the battlefield. And the Ukrainians are slowly being worn away. So there isn't the power, even if the Ukrainians were on the right side of the moral argument, and I don't think they are, but if they were, so it would be fair to say that if NATO were on the right side of the moral argument, then even if we were, then I think we would have to accept the conditions on the ground, because actually there isn't the political appetite, nor indeed the military capacity to intervene in a way which allows us to dictate the conditions. So as soon as you understand that, then everything gets much, much clearer. The conditions will be dictated by largely speaking, by Russia. I suspect there will be a bit of give and take in there, because I think Putin is a cautious and a highly intelligent man, and will want to particularly achieve a solution to this, which actually allows that reaffirmation of a good relationship, or a better relationship, between America and to Russia. He'll be less interested, I think, in Europe, but I think that would interest him.
They've been definitely talking about that here of late. And one of the other things that Zelensky mentioned in that clip we just played there is that he's trying to demand a full 30-day unconditional ceasefire as a precursor to making negotiations. There was, and unfortunately it was a really long description, but earlier today, a video was released in Russia from Sergei Lavrov, who was asked the same question. Will the Russians agree to a full 30-day unconditional ceasefire? And he went on this long thing and said, the short answer is no. The long answer is, look what happened in going back to February 2014, when they said we had negotiated an end to the crisis that was going on in the Maidan and had made the deal for early elections. And so we said, okay, fine, we're ready to let that happen. So we went with diplomacy, and then instead they forced out Yanukovych completely in violation of everything we did, and that never happened. And then he said, then you go to the Minsk agreements. And we said, yes, we'll agree to this situation here. We'll stop fighting. We'll stop funding and helping the rebels in the eastern part of the country or so. And they said, as long as you do your part, which is change your constitution to give limited autonomy to the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine, then we'll withdraw our support, and we'll just basically go home. And he said that wouldn't happen. Then, of course, the Istanbul talks, etc., and then you issued those as well. So we don't have any experience where we agree to any kind of a ceasefire that the West recognizes, and instead they keep using it to build back up power to go against us in the future. So why would we want to do that now? Is that just an excuse on the Russian side, or is it a valid argument?
No, I think it's the maintenance of a position which they've had since the start of the war. Indeed, I'm surprised on that basis that Lavrov's short answer was no and his long answer was no, because when you think about it, I mean, Russians have been saying this almost since the start of the special military operation, and I think what people are confusing is a ceasefire and a termination of the conflict for a long-term sustainable peace. And what the Russians want is a situation where they can make sure that those conditions are in place for that, and then they will go to a ceasefire as opposed to a ceasefire and then go into negotiation. Yeah. And who can blame them? We've, as you say, we in the West have, Boris Johnson's help.
And actually, let me ask you a question on that military. I want to stick on that point for a second there. Military, let's just say that you took national affiliations off and you just had side A and side B. And side A or side B is the one that has the unchallenged military power and dominance over the other side there. And you're made as a negotiator or an advisor to side B here. And side A, this side on the less power, is demanding a ceasefire from the side that has the most power so that they can negotiate something away. How would you advise side B whether they should or shouldn't accept a ceasefire under those conditions?
Well, I think the side which is militarily in the ascendancy, or overwhelmingly so, will dictate the conditions as they see them. And if I were the side which is on the reverse of those, I'd take whatever conditions I could get. Because if I were advising the Ukraine government, I would be somebody like Klitschko rather than Zelensky, because he's beyond advice, I think. Then I would take what conditions I would get, because I would be working on the basis that the longer I take to settle, then the worse conditions I'll end up with. I think we've seen this. The conditions always get worse and worse and worse. Yes. The Russians are prepared to accept a deal, but I think that the Europeans, and I suspect that through Trump's ambassador, I've forgotten his second name, Steve
Witkoff.
Yeah, I think through him, you're starting to see reflected back into the Western dialogue what the actions the Russians have been telling us, which is that there is a set of conditions which the Russians want, that the way that they plan to get there is through a long dialogue, or a dialogue which gets them to a situation where the conditions they're being offered meet their needs, and then they will go for a ceasefire rather than the other way around. And again, in their situation, that's exactly what I would do. I mean, I think that we're, in my mind, there are now sort of three scenarios, as far as I can see, about the way this ends. And I think the first is what I would call a US double down, where the US say, okay, we're going to put more pressure on Russia. We're going to increase arms sales. We're going to double down on sanctions. And I think the chance of that happening are extremely, and I hope that they are extremely low. So I don't think there's the political appetite for it, nor would there be the willingness to expend more money. I think the second is what I would call a US trickle out, where the US actually are accepting that this isn't going to work, but actually they're perhaps waiting until deciding not to get congressional funding for the follow-on arms. They've seen that Budanov has said that they expect the war to, the Ukrainian armed forces to start to really struggle in the summer, which I would anticipate. And they're also looking towards the midterms and thinking we need to get this cleared off by the midterms. But I think the other one, and I think which is a US step out, where the US say, okay, this is it, we've done our best and we'll step out. And to be honest, in terms of the overall war and the people on the ground and the people who are struggling as a result of it, the step out would be by far the best thing to do, because the trickle out would just extend the war. Probably not by that much long, but it would mean that at the end, that the conditions which were being offered to the Ukrainians, and indeed I suppose to NATO, would be even less. I think Keith Kellogg talked about security guarantees. Or sorry, it was the commentator since then. People seem to miss the point that there is no credible security guarantee that I can imagine that can be given to the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
And the best security guarantee they can have by far is that of neutrality. If they're in a situation of neutrality, then there's a good chance, I think, they'll have what they need.
Yeah, there's a piece out that just came out. It was just forwarded to me. It's from yesterday in the Times of London. It says Europe would struggle to put 25,000 troops on the ground in Ukraine. Not the UK. Europe would struggle to have that many. And if you can't even scrape together 25,000 as a so-called deterrence force, when Russia has about 600,000 inside the borders of Ukraine, then I don't know who's going to provide any guarantees of anything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've spotted, but there's the French have been wrecking what's called the Foscani Gap, and that's sort of in Romania, and it's sort of en route to Odessa. So it might be that they're still thinking about it, but it's talk about the charge of the Light Brigade. I mean, you're really throwing yourself into
that's it right there.
Throwing yourself into a really difficult situation. I would be very surprised if there's much appetite, certainly in this country. I don't know. I suspect it's the same with the French military as well. Much appetite at this stage to to basically, it would make the charge of the Light Brigade look like a sort of a walk in the park, frankly. As you say, if we could get 25,000 against a Russian army which has strategic bombardment capability and also has air superiority, there's no chance that we would want to. And I think if we ever got to that stage, I think the calculation which would stop it is the thought of coffins coming back into Paris, coffin coming back into London, and large numbers of coffins. I mean, I think
I'm not even worried as much about the coffins coming back as I am about Russian missiles arriving, which I don't think is an unreasonable possibility if we got into a war like that. But I honestly think that the more likely result is that a lot of these European leaders are hoping that Trump does the walkout deal version that you had, number 3, because then they can say, we were ready to go and with all these troops here, but Trump pulled the plug. So what can we do now? And then they're saved. Now then they don't have to ever make good on this. I bet that's what their hope is.
Yeah, I think you might be right. I mean, what we're starting to see, aren't we, I think, is the early signs of okay, how do we spin this in a different way? Because we're obviously going to lose. So how do we spin in a different way? It's going to be extremely difficult to spin, frankly. And I look forward.
They'll try, but it will be hard.
They'll do their best. They'll do their best.
They're very skilled at spin.
I look forward to the congressional investigations, and I look forward here in this country to the investigations. And I hope when they do it that they look not just at the Russia-Ukraine war, but they look at Afghanistan, they look at Iraq, they look at Libya, they look at Syria, and they look at this war and say, look, this is something gone very badly wrong because we've been on the losing side in all of these wars. And the truth is that with the possible exception of Iraq, we should never have started any of them. And it's been a major, major failure in strategic thinking in the West. And I include all of us in that, I'm afraid, Danny.
Yeah.
It's incredibly disappointing. And
would I like to have you back on one of these days just to talk about that kind of in a 30,000 foot level and just kind of hit all of those to see the context and the continuity between them, unfortunately.
I think it's not only those individually, but when you look at the totality, you see that time and again we've failed to we had this discussion when we first talked. We failed to do the strategic estimate in any of them. We failed to follow the Powell doctrine, I think his 7 tests. And if you applied the 7 tests that Powell described, it'd be worth going through that on a future podcast, but describe them. I would imagine that Ukraine would fail on all of those tests. I haven't looked through, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, the only one I think it's difficult to avoid the early years of Afghanistan because of the political situation and the need to hunt down. But the rest of it, I think, was almost all, without exception, were all mistakes.
Yes. Yeah. I wouldn't argue with any of those things there. But we'll look forward to having you back onto that. I'd like to keep going down some of those paths. And as you mentioned, there's a lot to discuss even on the Afghanistan situation where you and I were both involved with that one. So that would be a good session to go down as well.
Yeah, let's do that one day, Danny. Let's do a dissect Afghanistan and find out what went wrong.
I think it's time for that.
Yeah.
But we appreciate you guys joining with us today. Thank you for coming on with this one, Steve. We always appreciate your view on all of these issues that are going on in both the Middle East and in Europe. And we'll keep watching all of them. We'll keep bringing you guys whatever happens. And also to let you know that this afternoon we got one more show here. We got the famed Larry Johnson. Larry the Shirt is going to be back on at 3:30 p.m. this afternoon. Be sure and join us at Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and we will see you then.